The mud in Oakhaven wasn't just dirt, it was a judgment. It clung to the hem of Ada Gentry's skirts, like a heavy wet conscience, dragging her down with every step she took away from the church steps. The rain fell in sheets, cold and unrelenting, washing away the hypocrisy of Sunday prayers, but doing nothing to cleanse the cruelty in the hearts of the congregation. Ada stood alone in the center of the town square. She was 28, but in the gray light of the storm she looked ancient. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows of exhaustion. At her feet lay a small, pathetic pile of belongings, a worn shawl, a Bible, and a single wooden crate containing her few dresses. Facing her, on the dry, sheltered porch of the church, stood Caleb Gentry. Her husband, or rather, the man who had just annulled 10 years of marriage with a few signatures and a bag of coins paid to the circuit judge. Caleb was a handsome man in a weak, soft way. He wore his Sunday best, a suit that was too tight around the waist, and he held the arm of a girl who couldn't have been more than 18. The girl, Sarah, was blushing, her hand resting protectively over her flat stomach. "It is done, Ada," Caleb shouted over the roar of the rain. "The law is satisfied. The church is satisfied. You are no longer my wife." 10 years, Caleb," Ada whispered, though the wind snatched the words away. "I gave you 10 years of labor. I worked your fields. I mended your clothes. I nursed your mother until she died." "And you gave me no sons," Caleb screamed, his face twisting with a petulant rage. "A man needs an heir, Ada. A farm needs strong backs. You are a dry field, a barren tree that bears no fruit." The crowd that had gathered on the porch murmured in agreement. The older women, the matrons of Oakhaven who measured a woman's worth by the number of children clinging to her skirts, nodded grimly. "Barren," old Mrs. Gable hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's cursed. A dried-up womb is a sign of sin." "Useless," another voice chimed in. "Like a cow that won't calve. You cull a cow like that." Ada flinched as if struck. The words were stones thrown with precision to break her spirit. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the shattered pieces of her dignity together. "I tried, Caleb," she sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I prayed. I drank the tonics. I did everything." "God didn't listen," Caleb spat. "And now Sarah is here. She is young. She is fertile. She will give me what you couldn't." He kicked the crate at her feet. It slid through the mud, splashing sludge onto Ada's dress. "Take your trash and go, Ada. There's no place for you here. The workhouse in the city might take you. They always need scrub women." The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, jagged sound. Ada looked at them. She looked at the people she had known her whole life, the people she had helped, the children she had taught in Sunday school. They looked back with cold, hard eyes. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a failure of biology. She bent down to pick up her crate, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the wood. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. "Wait!" Caleb shouted, a new nasty idea forming in his mind. "Why should she just walk away? She ate my food for 10 years. She wasted my prime." He stepped off the porch, ignoring the mud on his boots. He grabbed Ada's arm. "Maybe I can get something back for the wasted time," he sneered. "Who needs a worker? She's strong enough for a mule, even if she's barren as a rock. I'll sell her indenture for $10. $10 for a cook and a cleaner." The crowd gasped, then tittered nervously. It was illegal, immoral, and utterly cruel. But no one stepped forward to stop him. $5, Caleb yelled, shaking her. $5 for the dry branch. "Let her go, Caleb," the pastor said weakly from the door, but he didn't move to intervene. "No!" Caleb screamed. "She owes me!" Then the ground shook. It was a subtle vibration at first, then a rhythmic pounding that silenced the rain. Thud, thud. A horse was coming, not a carriage horse and not a farm nag, a war horse. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they scrambled back, pressing themselves against the church walls. A rider emerged from the gloom of the storm. He was a giant. He rode a massive black percheron that stood 18 hands high, its coat shaggy and wet, steam blowing from its nostrils like dragon smoke. But the rider was the true terror. He was a mountain of a man, wrapped in a coat made of unrefined bear fur that still had the claws attached. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but a beard as thick and black as a briar patch covered his jaw. His shoulders were impossibly broad. He sat in the saddle with the stillness of a predator. Elias Thorne, the bear. He lived in the high Sierras, in the peaks where the snow never melted. He came down only twice a year to trade furs for powder and salt. They said he had killed a grizzly with a knife. They said he had no voice, only a growl. He rode into the square. The mud squelched under his horse's massive hooves. He stopped right in front of Caleb and Ada. Caleb froze. He looked up, and up. He released Ada's arm, as if it were burning hot. "Mr. Thorne," Caleb stammered, we were just conducting some family business." Elias didn't speak. He just sat there, the rain drumming on his leather coat. Then slowly he turned his head. He looked at Ada. He looked at the woman shivering in the mud, her dress ruined, her face a mask of absolute despair. He looked at the crate. He looked at the empty space where a husband should have been standing. "Barren," Elias rumbled. The word was like a rock slide. It vibrated in Ada's chest. She closed her eyes, waiting for the mockery, waiting for the giant to laugh. "That is what they said," Elias growled, his voice low and dangerous. "A dry branch, useless." He looked at Caleb. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of his hat, burned with an amber fire that made Caleb take a step back. "You throw away a woman because she does not give you a calf?" Elias asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with judgment. She is my wife no longer," Caleb squeaked. "She is free to go. I was just helping her find work." Elias snorted. It was a sound of pure disgust. He reached into his coat. The crowd held its breath. Was he reaching for a gun? A knife? He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it. It hit Caleb in the chest with enough force to knock the wind out of him. Caleb stumbled back, clutching the bag. He opened it. Gold dust. Pure, heavy gold dust from the high streams. "For the wasted time," Elias said, his voice dripping with irony. You want to buy her?" Caleb asked, greed overcoming his fear. Elias ignored him. He nudged his horse forward. The massive beast stepped up to Ada. Elias reached down. Ada flinched. She looked up at the terrifying figure looming over her. She saw only darkness and fur. "Come," Elias said. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. "Why?" Ada whispered, her voice cracking. "I am barren. I can give you no sons." Elias leaned down. His face came into the light. He wasn't handsome in the way Caleb was. He was scarred, weathered, his skin like old leather. But his eyes were not cruel. They were old, and they were sad. "I do not need sons," Elias rumbled, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. "I need a woman who knows how to survive the rain." He extended his hand. It was the size of a shovel blade, calloused and scarred. "They say you are empty," Elias said, loud enough for the town to hear. "I say you are full of strength. They are too blind to see." He looked at the crowd, then back at her. "She is the one I chose." Ada looked at his hand. Then she looked at Caleb, who was busy counting the gold. She looked at the town that had rejected her. She reached up. Elias's hand closed around hers. It was warm. It was solid. He lifted her effortlessly, swinging her up onto the saddle in front of him. She landed against his chest. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and wet fur. He was a furnace of heat against the freezing rain. He unbuttoned his massive coat and wrapped the edge of it around her, shielding her from the storm, shielding her from the stairs. "Hold on," he growled. He kicked the horse. They surged forward, leaving the mud, the church, and the cool laughter of Oakhaven behind. Ada clung to the saddle horn, her face pressed against the rough wool of his shirt, listening to the steady, thundering beat of his heart as they climbed toward the dark, jagged peaks where the air was thin and the silence was absolute. The climb into the high Sierras was a journey not just into altitude, but into a different epoch of the earth. The rain that had soaked Oakhaven turned to sleet, stinging Ada's face like thrown gravel, and then, as the air grew thin and biting, it transformed into a silent, heavy snow. It fell in flakes the size of coins, blanketing the world in a white silence that felt heavy enough to crush a lung. Ada huddled against Elias's chest, buried in the immense bear fur coat that smelled of old wood smoke, pine resin, and the metallic tang of dried blood. She couldn't feel her feet. She couldn't feel her hands. All she could feel was the terrifying rhythmic heat of the man holding her. He didn't speak. He didn't curse the wind that tried to tear them from the saddle. He navigated the treacherous, narrow switchbacks with a grim, practiced competence. Every so often, the massive horse, which he called Titan, would stumble on the slick granite, and Elias would grunt, a low vibration against her back, tightening his grip around her waist, anchoring her to the beast. Hours bled into a gray, timeless haze. The trees changed from the leafy oaks of the valley to twisted, ancient pines that clung to the rock with desperate roots. Finally, Titan crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. "Home," Elias rasped. The word was a rusty hinge opening a door that hadn't moved in years. Ada peered out from the coat. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Built directly into the jagged face of a granite cliff, the cabin was a monstrous structure of blackened logs, some as thick as wine barrels. A massive chimney belched thick gray smoke into the storm, staining the pristine snow. To the side, a sturdy lean to sheltered a stack of wood that could have built 3 houses in Oakhaven. Elias dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that shook the snow from his boots. He didn't offer a hand. He simply reached up, grabbed her by the waist, and swung her down. Her legs, numb from the cold and the long ride, gave way the moment her boots touched the snow. She crumpled into a heap. Elias caught her by the scruff of the coat, hauling her upright. He didn't carry her like a bride. He marched her toward the heavy oak door, his hand firm on her arm, dragging her along like a piece of luggage he was eager to stow. He kicked the door open. Heat hit her like a physical blow. It was dry, intense, and smelled of curing leather and animal musk. They stepped inside. Ada gasped. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a den. The center of the room was dominated by a massive stone hearth that roared with an orange, crackling fire. The walls were lined with furs, wolf, bear, cougar stretched on frames to dry. Traps of all sizes, steel jaws gleaming dully in the firelight, hung from the rafters. The floor was rough-hewn planking, stained with oil and age. There was no softness here, no curtains, no rugs, no delicate china. It was a space designed for survival, not comfort. Elias released her. He walked straight to the hearth. He grabbed a heavy iron poker and stabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He turned to her. He was covered in snow, his beard stiff with ice. He looked wilder here, in his element, than he had in the town square. He pointed to a rough wooden chair near the fire. "Sit," he growled. Ada nodded, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would crack. She walked to the chair, feeling small and utterly out of place in this cathedral of wildness. She sat on the edge of the seat, clutching her wet shawl. Elias went back to the door. He brought in her crate, the pathetic box of her life, and set it down with a thud. "I have chores," he said flatly. "Stock needs feed. Wood needs splitting." He looked at her. His eyes, amber and unreadable, swept over her shivering form. "Stay warm. Do not touch the traps." And then he was gone. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving her alone with the fire and the silence. For a long time, Ada just sat there, listening to the wind howl outside and the thwack-thwack of an axe hitting wood somewhere in the storm. Panic began to rise in her chest, a cold, suffocating tide. "Why am I here?" she thought frantically. "He bought me. He paid gold. What does he want?" Caleb's voice echoed in her mind, useless. Barren, a dry branch. She looked around the cabin. It was dirty, not filthy, but neglected. Dust lay thick on the mantel. The floor was scattered with pine needles and dried mud. A stack of tin plates on the table was greasy. A terrified thought seized her. If I am useless here, he will throw me out, just like Caleb. And out there is death. She couldn't be a wife. She couldn't give him sons, so she had to be a servant. She had to be indispensable. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was iron. "Work," she whispered to the empty room. "Work is prayer. Work is survival." She found a broom made of stiff twigs in the corner. She began to sweep. She swept the dust into the fire. She found a rag and a bucket of water near the door. She scrubbed the table. She scrubbed the grease from the plates. She moved with a frantic energy, trying to erase her fear with every stroke of the rag. Then she heard it. A low, pained whimper. It was coming from the back of the cabin, behind a heavy curtain made of elk hide. Ada froze. Elias had said not to touch the traps. He hadn't said anything about what was behind the curtain. The whimper came again. It was a sound of misery. Ada hesitated. Fear told her to stay by the fire. But 10 years of nursing a sick mother-in-law, 10 years of tending to farm animals, had instilled an instinct in her that was stronger than fear. She walked to the curtain. She pulled it back. The smell hit her first, the copper tang of old blood and the sickly sweet scent of infection. It was a kennel area. 3 massive dachshunds mixed with something wilder. Perhaps Wolf looked up at her. 2 of them growled low in their throats, baring yellow teeth. They were chained to the wall. But the 3rd dog didn't growl. It was a female, lying on a pile of straw. She was gray and white, with eyes that were clouded with pain. Her left front leg was swollen to twice its normal size. A jagged tear, likely from a boar tusk or a trap, ran down the forearm. The wound was angry red, oozing yellow pus. The dog looked at Ada. She didn't snarl. She whined, thumping her tail once against the floor. Ada's heart broke. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered. She forgot about Elias. She forgot about the Barren curse. She saw a creature in pain. She went back to the main room. She found the kettle on the hob. The water was hot. She found a cleanish rag. She looked for medicine. On a high shelf she found a jar of pine tar and a tin of something that smelled like sulfur, mountain medicine. She returned to the dogs. The 2 healthy ones watched her with suspicion, straining at their chains. Ada ignored them. She knelt in the straw beside the injured female. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice dropping to the low, soothing hum she used for skittish colts. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to take the fire out." The dog trembled but didn't bite. Ada worked. She cleaned the wound with the hot water, flinching at the smell but not stopping. The dog whimpered when she pressed the puss out, but Ada held her firm, stroking her ears with one hand while she worked with the other. "Shh," Ada crooned. I know it hurts. Pain is a thief, isn't it? It takes everything." She applied the pine tar salve. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, the white cotton stark against the dark fur, and bound the leg tight. She sat there for a moment, stroking the dog's head. The animal let out a long sigh and rested her chin on Ada's knee. "You're a good girl," Ada whispered. "You're strong. You just needed a little help." The door to the cabin burst open. A gust of snow swirled in. Elias stood there, an armload of firewood stacked to his chin. He looked like a golem of ice and timber. He kicked the door shut. He dumped the wood by the hearth with a deafening crash. He looked at the empty chair where he had told her to sit. He frowned. His hand went to the knife at his belt. "Woman?" he barked. Ada scrambled up from behind the curtain. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's going to be angry." I touched his things. "I'm here," she squeaked. Elias strode across the room. He ripped the curtain back. He saw the dogs. He saw the two healthy ones cowering slightly, and he saw the injured female, the one he had planned to put down because the infection was spreading, sleeping peacefully. He saw the clean white bandage on her leg. He smelled the pine tar. He turned slowly to look at Ada. She was standing against the wall, bracing herself. "She was hurting," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "The infection was deep. I cleaned it." Elias looked at the dog again. He crouched down. He inspected the bandage. It was tight, professional, better than he could have done with his sausage fingers. He stood up. He towered over her. The heat radiating from him was intense. "They bite strangers," he rumbled. "She didn't bite me," Ada whispered. Elias stared at her. He looked at her hands, red, raw, shaking, but capable. He looked at the scrub table. He looked at the floor, swept clean of his mess. He had bought her because he pitied her, because he needed someone to keep the fire while he checked the high lines. He expected her to be useless, a burden he would carry until the spring. But the dog Bess was his best tracker, and this barren woman had just saved her. He grunted. It was a low sound, deep in his chest. He walked to the larder. He grabbed a slab of dried venison and a handful of flour. He put them on the table. "Stew," he said. "Make it thick. The cold eats the meat off a man's bones." He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. But as he turned to warm his hands by the fire, Ada saw him glance one last time at the sleeping dog, and his shoulders, usually tense as a drawn bowstring, lowered just an inch. She hadn't been thrown out. Ada let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She walked to the table and picked up the meat. Useful, she thought. I am useful. And for the first time in 10 years the word didn't feel like a heavy stone. It felt like a foundation. The blizzard that struck the high Sierras 3 days later was not merely a storm, it was a burial. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a high, thin wail that sounded like the ghosts of every man who had ever died on the peak. It drove snow into the chinks of the logs, piling drifts against the north wall, until the window was nothing but a gray blind eye. Inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the radius of the hearth's warmth. Elias had been restless all day. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters, checking the rifles. He moved with a heavy, dragging gait that Ada hadn't noticed before. He was sweating, despite the draft that snaked across the floorboards. "Elias?" Ada asked from her chair by the fire, where she was mending a tear in his spare shirt. "You're dripping." "Fire's too hot," Elias grunted. He turned away from her, shrugging his massive shoulders as if to dislodge a weight. He grabbed the water bucket. It was empty. "I'll fetch snow to melt," he rasped. He reached for the door latch. He missed. His hand swiped clumsily at the wood. He swayed, like a great pine whose roots had finally snapped. "Elias." Ada dropped the shirt. He didn't answer. His knees buckled. The impact of his body hitting the floor shook the entire cabin. The water bucket clattered away, rolling into the shadows. Ada was beside him in a heartbeat. She turned him over. He was burning. The heat radiating from him was terrifying, a dry, feverish fire that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. His skin was gray beneath the beard, and his eyes were rolled back, showing the whites. "No," Ada whispered, panic fluttering in her throat. "Not now. Not in the storm." She grabbed his hand. It was scorching. She pushed up the sleeve of his shirt. Nothing. She checked his other arm. Nothing. She ripped open the front of his shirt. There on his side, just above the hip bone, was the enemy. It was a puncture wound, deep, jagged, and angry. It looked days old. The skin around it was swollen tight and shiny, radiating streaks of red poison that were tracking toward his heart. A trap accident? A slip of a knife? He had hidden it. He had suffered in silence, the stubborn fool, until the infection had overtaken him. "You stubborn mule," Ada hissed, tears pricking her eyes. "You prideful, stupid man." She didn't have time to be afraid. She didn't have time to worry about being useless. If she didn't act, the mountain would claim him before morning. She ran to the larder. She grabbed the willow bark she had seen in the jar. She grabbed the dried yarrow. She grabbed the whiskey bottle. She dragged the heavy iron kettle to the fire. She filled it with the last of the water in the pitcher. She returned to him. He was too heavy to move to the bed. She would have to nurse him on the floor, on the bearskin rug. "Elias," she said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Wake up. You have to drink." He groaned, thrashing his head from side to side. "The ice," he mumbled, his voice thick and delirious. "Samuel, don't let go. The ice is too thin." Ada froze. Samuel, a name she didn't know. She soothed, lifting his heavy head into her lap. "There's no ice here, only fire." She forced the willow bark tea between his lips. He choked, coughed, but swallowed. For 3 days and 3 nights the storm raged outside, and Ada fought a war inside. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She became a creature of constant motion. She changed the poultices on his wound every hour, flinching at the smell of corruption but never stopping. She bathed his forehead with cool snowmelt she gathered by cracking the door just an inch. She held him down when the fever dreams made him thrash and fight invisible demons. She wasn't the barren woman of Oakhaven. She wasn't the cast-off wife. She was the keeper of the flame. She was the barrier between the man and the dark. She saw his body the scars that mapped a life of violence and survival. She saw the vulnerability of the giant when he was stripped of his strength. She saw the man beneath the legend, and her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, began to ache for him. On the 4th morning the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The sun, weak and pale, filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Elias opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. The amber was clear, though exhausted. He lay still, listening to the crackle of the fire. He felt the pain in his side, a dull throb now, not the sharp agony of poison. He felt the cool cloth on his head. He turned his head. Ada was sitting on the floor beside him, her back against the woodbox. She was asleep, her head lolling on her chest. Her face was gray with exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. Her hands, stained with herbs and soot, lay open in her lap. Elias tried to sit up. A groan escaped him. Ada's eyes snapped open. She was awake instantly, scrambling to her knees. "Elias?" She reached for his forehead. "Are you with me?" Elias caught her wrist. His grip was weak, shaking, but his skin was cool. The fever had broken. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was a wreck, like gravel in a grinder. "Where would I go?" Ada asked softly, checking his pulse. "The storm buried us." "You could have let me die," Elias said. He looked at the bandage on his side. "I hid it. I thought I could sweat it out." "You almost died of pride," Ada scolded gently. "If I hadn't found the yarrow—" She stopped. She pulled her hand back. She looked down at her lap. "I thought you would be angry," she whispered. "That I touched you. That I took charge." Elias looked at her. He saw the strength in her shoulders. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Because I am useful," Ada said, the old defense rising automatically. "I can nurse. I can cook. I earned my keep, Elias. You can't throw me out. I saved you." Elias frowned. He struggled to push himself up on one elbow. "Throw you out? Is that what you think this is?" "I am Barren," Ada blurted out. The shame she had carried for 10 years spilled over in the quiet cabin. "Caleb threw me out because I couldn't give him a son. I know why you bought me. You need a worker. But a worker who can't breed is just a mouth to feed in the winter." She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I am a dry field, Elias. A dead garden. That's what they said." Elias stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the popping of the fire. Then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was a dry, rusty sound devoid of humor, but full of irony. "A dead garden," he repeated. He shook his head, wincing at the pain in his side. He looked at the fire. "I had a brother, Samuel. He was 10. I was 12. Ada went still. The name from the fever dream. "We were crossing the high pass," Elias continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was late winter. The crust was thin. He fell through, into the crevasse." He closed his eyes. "I held his hand for an hour. I wasn't strong enough to pull him up, and he was too frozen to hold on. I felt his hand slip. I heard him hit the bottom." He opened his eyes and looked at Ada. They were wet. "I swore then," he whispered. "I swore I would never bring a child into this world, not up here. The mountain eats the young, Ada. It eats the soft things. It takes them, and it breaks them, and it laughs." He reached out. His large hand covered hers. "I didn't buy a broodmare, Ada. I didn't want a mother for my sons." He squeezed her hand. "I wanted a partner. I wanted someone who knows what it is to be broken and still stand up. I watched you on those steps. You didn't beg. You stood there. You took the mud, and you didn't break." He leaned closer, his eyes burning into hers. "Caleb Gentry is a fool. He wanted a crop. I wanted the earth. I wanted the rock that stays when the storm comes." Ada stared at him. Her breath hitched in her chest. For 10 years her worth had been measured by the emptiness of her womb, and now this giant, this terrifying man, was telling her that her emptiness was not a flaw, but a compatibility, that he had chosen her because she was a survivor, not a vessel. You don't want children?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I want silence," Elias said firmly. "I want the dogs. I want the fire. And I want a woman who is strong enough to hold my hand when the fever takes me and not let go." He looked at the bandage on his side. "You held on, Ada. You didn't let me fall." Ada felt the crushing weight of the Barren label begin to crack. It fell away, shard by heavy shard. She wasn't useless. She was the rock. She was the one he chose. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. It was an intimate gesture, far more intimate than anything she had ever shared with Caleb. "I didn't let go," she whispered, "and I won't." Elias let out a long sigh, his head falling back onto the pillow she had made for him. He kept her hand trapped in his. "Good," he mumbled, his eyes drifting shut as natural sleep finally overtook him. "Because the winter is long, Ada, and I am tired of being cold." Ada sat there as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She looked at the man sleeping at her feet, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a dry branch. She felt like the root that held the mountain together. "Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below," Gemini said. The spring thaw did not come gently to the high Sierras. It arrived with the violence of a breaking fever, much like the one that had nearly taken Elias. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater and mud, tearing through the ravine below the cabin like a brown scar. The icicles that had hung like daggers from the eaves for months lost their grip, crashing onto the porch with startling glass-like explosions. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had shifted. The air was no longer just hot, it was humid, thick with the smell of wet earth and the eternal metallic tang of the curing hides. Ada stood by the woodpile, her face flushed, sweat causing her shirt to cling to her back. She wasn't the pale, shivering ghost who had ridden up the mountain in a crate. Her arms, once thin and trembling, had grown wiry and strong over the long winter. She wore a heavy leather apron Elias had cut down for her, cinched tight at the waist. Elias was down in the lower paddock, mending the fence that the snow had crushed. He was shirtless, his scars shining in the pale sunlight, swinging a heavy sledgehammer to drive a new post into the softening earth. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was rhythmic, a heartbeat of the homestead. He paused, wiping his brow with his forearm. He looked up at the cabin. He looked at Ada. The amber fire in his eyes had softened over the months, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He didn't speak. He rarely did, but he raised a hand. It was a language they had built in the silence fence's holding. "We are good." Suddenly, the dogs went wild. Bess, the hound Ada had nursed, scrambled out from under the porch, her hackles raised, a low, guttural snarl ripping from her throat. The other two joined her, a chorus of alarms that echoed off the canyon walls. Elias went still. The sledgehammer hovered in the air. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the fence post. It was hoofbeats, many of them, scrambling up the shale path that was treacherous even in dry weather. Ada dropped the armload of wood she was holding. "Elias?" she whispered, her hand going to her throat. Elias didn't move toward the cabin. He moved toward the gate, placing himself between the trail and the house. He gripped the handle of the sledgehammer until his knuckles turned white. Down in the yard, emerging from the mist like ghosts from a bad dream, were 4 riders. They were mud-spattered, their horses heaving from the climb. Leading them, perched on a nervous bay mare, was Caleb Gentry. He looked different than he had on the church steps. He wore a heavy oilskin coat and a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest, a deputy's star, likely bought or borrowed. His face was twisted with a frantic, feverish greed. Flanking him were 3 men Ada recognized from the saloon, rough men, hired guns with low-slung holsters and eyes that scanned the property with professional detachment. "Thorne!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the creek. "Elias Thorne, step away from the woman!" Elias didn't move. He stood like a statue carved from granite, the sledgehammer resting easily on his shoulder. "She's where she belongs," Elias rumbled. His voice carried effortlessly, deep and vibrating with lethal promise. Caleb laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Belongs? You bought her, you savage! But you didn't buy the rights to the family silver?" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of paper. It fluttered in the wind. "I have a warrant," Caleb screamed, waving the paper, "for the arrest of Ada Gentry, for the theft of a grandmother's locket, and for the arrest of Elias Thorne for kidnapping and holding a woman against her will." Ada, standing on the porch, felt a cold knot of rage tighten in her stomach. Theft? She had left with nothing but the clothes on her back. "There is no locket," Elias growled. "Leave." "Liar!" Caleb shrieked. He looked at the cabin, his eyes hungry. He wasn't here for a locket. He was here because he had seen the pouch of gold dust Elias had thrown in the mud. He was here because he realized he had sold a gold mine for a pittance. "Search the cabin," Caleb ordered the men. "Find the gold, and grab the girl. She can work off her crime in the county jail." The men dismounted. One of them, a man with a scarred nose and a sawed-off shotgun, grinned. "Step aside, bear man," the gunman sneered. Elias didn't step aside. He shifted his grip on the sledgehammer. "Take one more step," Elias whispered, the sound carrying a terrifying weight, "and I will bury you here." The gunman laughed and raised the shotgun. Boom! The blast shattered the mountain peace. It didn't hit Elias. The gunman had fired into the air, a warning shot meant to spook him. It was a mistake. Elias Thorne did not spook. The bear emerged. He roared. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that shook the remaining snow from the pine boughs. He charged. He moved with a speed that defied his size. He covered the 20 feet between the gate and the gunman in 3 strides. He didn't swing the sledgehammer like a tool. He swung it like a warhammer. Crunch! The head of the sledgehammer connected with the shoulder of the gunman's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the rider backward into the mud. Elias didn't stop. He was a whirlwind of violence. He dropped the hammer and grabbed the fallen rider by the collar, lifting him one-handed and hurling him into the man beside him. "Shoot him! Shoot the freak!" Caleb screamed, wheeling his horse around in panic, trying to keep his distance. A bullet struck the ground inches from Elias's foot, kicking up mud. Another pinged off the metal of the gate. Elias ignored them. He grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the fence. He didn't throw it. He used it like a staff, sweeping the legs of the third gunman, sending him crashing into the slush. But there were too many of them. The gunman with the shotgun had recovered. He scrambled to his knees, blood pouring from his nose where he had hit the ground. He leveled the weapon at Elias's exposed back. "Die, you animal!" he screamed. Elias was occupied wrestling the second man. He couldn't turn in time. Inside the cabin doorway, Ada Gentry watched. She saw the violence. She saw the blood. She saw the man who had nursed her, the man who had held her hand through the winter, about to be slaughtered like a hog. The terror that had ruled her life, the fear of Caleb, the fear of the town, the fear of being useless, vanished. It was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "I am not a dry branch," she thought. "I am the root." She turned back into the cabin. She didn't grab her broom. She grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle Elias kept above the mantel. He had taught her to use it. "Pull the lever. Seat the round. Squeeze, don't pull." She grabbed a handful of cartridges from the box. She walked back onto the porch. She raised the rifle. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. She jammed the stock against her shoulder. "Hey!" she screamed. The gunman with the shotgun turned, startled by the noise. Ada didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes. Bam! The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The shot went wide of the man, but it shattered the stock of his shotgun, sending splinters flying into his face. The man dropped the weapon, howling, clutching his hands. "Get away from him!" Ada screamed, working the lever clack-clack, chambering a new round. She leveled the rifle at Caleb. Caleb stared at her. He sat on his horse, his face pale as milk. He looked at the carnage in the yard, men groaning in the mud, horses panicked. He looked at Elias, who was now standing over the fallen men, chest heaving, a demon of mud and muscle. And he looked at his ex-wife, the woman he had called Barren, the woman he had thrown away. She stood on the porch, feet planted wide, the rifle steady as a rock. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of an executioner. "Ada," Caleb stammered, You can't shoot me. I'm the law." "You are a thief and a liar, Caleb Gentry," Ada yelled, her voice echoing off the cliffs. "You sold me. You have no claim here." She took a step down the stairs. "You called me useless," she shouted, the anger of 10 years finally erupting. "Is this useless? Is holding a gun on a coward useless?" Caleb's horse danced nervously, sensing his fear. "Now, Ada, be reasonable. We just want the gold." "There is no gold for you." Ada fired a warning shot that kicked up the dirt right under his horse's hooves. The horse bolted. Caleb shrieked, clinging to the mane as the animal reared and tore down the path, terrified by the noise and the smell of blood. "Run!" Ada screamed after him. "Run back to your mother, Caleb, and tell her the Barren woman sends her regards." The remaining hired guns didn't wait. They scrambled for their mounts, dragging their injured comrades, slipping and sliding in the mud to get away from the giant and his fire-breathing wife. Elias watched them go. He stood there, the adrenaline slowly draining from his massive frame, leaving him shaking. He dropped the pitchfork. He turned slowly to face the porch. He looked at Ada. She was still holding the rifle, the barrel smoking in the cold air. Her chest was heaving. Her hair had come loose from its bun, framing her face in a wild halo. She looked fierce. She looked terrifying. She looked beautiful. Elias limped toward the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her, amber eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "You shot," he rasped, his voice rough. "I missed," Ada said, her voice trembling slightly now that the danger was gone. "On purpose." Elias looked at the shattered shotgun on the ground. "You didn't miss much." He reached up a hand. It was bloody, covered in mud. Ada didn't recoil. She lowered the rifle. She reached down and took his hand. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," Elias grunted, "just surprised." He squeezed her hand. "They came for the gold," he said quietly, "but they almost took the real treasure." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the woman who cooked his meals but the partner who defended his life. "You are not a dry branch, Ada," he whispered, the awe still coloring his voice. "You are a storm." Ada looked down at him, a fierce smile touching her lips. "Then you better come inside, Elias, before the storm gets cold." The silence that followed the gunfire was heavier than the blizzard had been. It pressed down on the valley, suffocating the roar of the creek and the wind in the pines. The air on the porch tasted of sulfur, sharp and metallic, and the copper tang of fresh blood where one of the children had fallen. Ada lowered the rifle. The barrel was hot against her palm, burning through the calluses she had earned over the winter. Her hands, which had been steady enough to pull the trigger, began to tremble violently. The adrenaline that had turned her into a warrior was receding, leaving a cold, hollow shock in its wake. Elias groaned. He was kneeling at the bottom of the steps, his good hand gripping the railing until the wood splintered. His left arm was a mess, a jagged slice from a knife he hadn't even felt during the melee. Blood soaked the sleeve of his shirt, turning the gray wool black and slick. "Elias," Ada gasped, the paralysis breaking. She scrambled down the steps, her boots slipping in the mud that was still steaming from the fight. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, terrified to touch it, terrified not to. "Inside," Elias rasped. His face was gray, the color drained away to leave his tan looking like old parchment. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the dirt and gunpowder residue. "Before, more come." "No one is coming," Ada said, her voice shaking. "They ran. You scared the devil out of them." "Inside," he repeated, stubborn as the granite he lived on. He tried to stand. His legs buckled. Ada didn't think. She jammed her shoulder under his good arm. She was half his size, a reed against an oak, but she pushed with a hysterical strength. "Up," she commanded. "Move your feet, Bear. Don't you dare die in the mud." Elias grunted, a sound of pure agony, and forced his legs to work. Together they stumbled up the stairs, a three-legged beast of burden lurching toward the sanctuary of the door. They crashed into the cabin, Elias collapsing onto the bearskin rug before they could reach the bed. He lay there, breathing in shallow, hitching gasps, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. Ada kicked the door shut and threw the heavy oak bar into place. Then she turned to the war she could fight. She grabbed the shears. She grabbed the whiskey. She grabbed the needle. "I have to cut the shirt," she said, kneeling beside him. Elias nodded weakly. She sheared the wool away. The wound was ugly, a long, shallow gash that ran from his elbow to his wrist. It bled freely, but as she cleaned it, pouring the whiskey that made him arch his back and hiss through his teeth, she saw that the muscle was intact. "Clean cut," she whispered, relief making her dizzy. "Just flesh." She threaded the needle. Her hands, scarred and raw from the winter work, found their rhythm. She stitched the mountain man back together, sewing the edges of his skin with the same care she had once used to mend her husband's shirts. But this time, she wasn't serving a master. She was healing a partner. Elias watched her through slit eyes. He watched the fierce concentration on her face. He watched the way her hair, freed from its pins during the fight, fell across her face, no longer pulled back in the severe bun of a matron. When the last knot was tied, Ada sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. She was exhausted, her face streaked with soot and tears. Elias reached out with his good hand. He grabbed the edge of the table and pulled himself into a sitting position, ignoring her protests. "You need to lie down," Ada scolded, reaching for him. "No," Elias growled. He looked at the floorboards. He looked at the rifle leaning against the wall. He looked at the shattered piece of his home. "You have to go," he said. The words hung in the air, colder than the draft from the door. Ada blinked. "What?" Elias dragged himself to the heavy iron box he kept under the floorboard, his life savings, the gold dust from the trap lines. He threw the lid open. It was full. It was enough to buy a farm in the valley, a ticket east, a new life. He pushed the box toward her. "Take it," he rasped, avoiding her eyes. "Take Titan. He knows the way down. Go to the city. Find a doctor who can tell you that Caleb was wrong." Ada stared at the gold. Then she stared at him. A slow, hot anger began to bubble in her chest, replacing the fear. "You're sending me away?" she asked quietly. "After I just fought for you?" "Because you fought for me!" Elias roared, the sudden volume making him wince in pain. He slammed his hand on the floor. "Look at this place, Ada. It's a target. I am a target." He gestured to his blood-soaked arm. "I brought this to you," he choked out, his voice cracking with guilt. "I bought you to give you silence, to give you safety, and instead I brought gunmen to your door. I made you hold a killing weapon." He looked at her then, and the anguish in his amber eyes was a physical weight. "I am a beast, Ada. Violence follows me like a shadow. You are too good to be covered in my blood. You deserve a life where you don't have to sew up knife wounds. You deserve a man who can give you everything." He pushed the box closer, his hand trembling. "Go. Find a soft life. Be safe." Ada looked at the box. She looked at the gold that represented her freedom. She stood up. She walked over to the box. She picked it up. It was heavy. Elias watched her, his heart breaking in his chest. He told himself, it was for the best. She would go. She would find a husband who didn't live in a cave. She would be happy. Ada turned and walked to the door. Then she turned back. She didn't walk out. She walked to the hearth. She tilted the box. Whoosh! She dumped the gold dust onto the stone hearth, right into the ashes of the fire. The yellow powder scattered among the coals, glittering uselessly in the heat, melting into slag. Elias stared, his mouth falling open. "Ada?" Ada dropped the empty box on the floor. She walked back to him. She didn't look soft. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the iron he hammered in the forge, hardened, tested, and unbreakable. "You think I want soft?" she asked, her voice trembling with intensity. "Elias, I lived in soft. The town was civilized. The people who threw me away wore silk and velvet. The man who called me Barren was a gentleman." She knelt in front of him, invading his space, forcing him to look at her. "Softness didn't save me," she whispered. "Softness let me rot. Softness mocked me while I scrubbed the church steps." She reached out and took his large, rough hand, the hand that had saved her from the mud. She pressed it against her stomach. "You think I'm empty because I carry no child?" she asked. "I carried you through the fever. I carried this house through the winter. I carried a rifle today." She leaned closer, her nose inches from his. "You say violence follows you. Well, it followed me too. But out here, we fight back. I am not a porcelain doll you can put on a shelf. I am the woman who stood beside you." The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. He stopped breathing. He looked at her face. He saw the soot. He saw the exhaustion. But mostly, he saw the fire. For months, he had been careful not to touch her, afraid of frightening her, afraid of being the beast she feared. But now, in the firelight, he saw her for what she was. She wasn't a dry branch. She was the oak. She was the root that held the mountain together. "Ada," he breathed, his voice breaking. He reached up with his trembling hand. He cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of gunpowder. "Not Barren," Elias whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Full. You are full of life." He leaned forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his arm. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a claiming. It was deep, slow, and full of a terrifying tenderness. He kissed the years of shame away from her lips. He kissed the useless label into oblivion. Ada let out a sob, a sound of pure, fracturing relief. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his beard, holding him as tight as she could. Elias pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "Wife," he rumbled, "my wife." It wasn't a question. It was a vow. It was a claiming deeper than any paper or gold dust could buy. Ada smiled, a tear tracking through the soot on her face. "And don't you forget it, Bear." Elias let out a laugh, a wet, choke sound, and pulled her down against his good shoulder. The wind howled outside, and the broken silence of the mountain began to heal, but it didn't matter. The fire was lit, the door was barred, and the barren woman had finally found a harvest that would never fail. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer sun hit the high Sierras with a brilliance that made the granite sparkle like diamonds. The snow was gone, replaced by a carpet of green sedge and wildflowers that clung to the rocky soil with stubborn defiance. The cabin still stood against the cliff, But it had changed. A new room had been added to the side, a workshop for curing hides. The fence was mended, strong and straight. But the biggest change was the porch. A rocking chair carved from pine by a steady hand sat near the door, and in it sat Ada. She was shelling peas into a bowl. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, the sleeves rolled up to reveal her strong tanned arms. She looked out over the valley with eyes that were clear and at peace. She wasn't holding a baby. There was no cradle rocking beside her. The womb was still quiet, as it always would be. But the house was full. 3 dogs lay at her feet, Bess and 2 pups she had whelped in the spring. They thumped their tails as Ada hummed a tune. Elias came up the path from the creek. He carried a string of trout. He was shirtless, his scars shining in the sun, moving with the easy, rolling power of a king in his own land. The beard was trimmed, and his eyes were clear, crinkling at the corners as he looked up at the porch. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her with disappointment. He looked at her with a reverence usually reserved for the mountains themselves. "Supper," he called out, lifting the fish. Ada stopped shelling. She looked down at him, her smile bright enough to shame the sun. "Good catch, husband," she called back. Elias walked up the steps. He dropped the fish in a bucket. He walked over to her. He didn't care about the watching jays. He didn't care about the world below. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Then he placed his large, calloused hand over her hand as it rested on the bowl. "We are enough," he whispered. "A daily ritual, a daily promise." Ada covered his hand with hers. She looked at the man who had pulled her from the mud, the man who had given her a life where she was measured by her strength, not her fruit. "We are more than enough," she agreed. "We are plenty." The wind blew through the pines, carrying the scent of pine and peace. To the people of Oakhaven, Ada Gentry was a cautionary tale, a woman erased. But up here, in the thin air where only the strong survived, she was a legend. She was the woman who tamed the bear, not with a child, but with a heart big enough to hold the whole mountain.